Some parents get a phone call that changes their lives forever. I got 3 days of silence instead, and somehow, that silence hurt even more. My name is Michael Donovan. I'm 54 years old, and for the last 30 years I've owned a commercial roofing company just outside Columbus, Ohio. It isn't glamorous work, but it built a good life. It paid for 2 college educations, family vacations, birthday parties, and every opportunity I never had growing up. My daughter Emily is 28. My son Ryan just turned 30. They're successful, independent, and living in different states. That's exactly what I wanted for them. People always told me I'd have a hard time letting go once the kids moved out. Maybe they were right. I never called to check where they were every hour. I never demanded to know who they were with or what they were doing. But every few days I'd send a text or make a quick call just to hear their voices. "Hey kiddo, everything good?" Most of the time I'd get a simple reply. "Busy, Dad. I'll call you later." That was enough. As a parent, sometimes all you need is proof that your children are okay. My wife Susan used to laugh about it. "You're going to be 80 years old and still checking if they ate lunch." I'd laugh with her. "Probably." She'd smile, shake her head, and say, "That's one of the reasons they love you." I believed that. I never imagined those words would eventually come back to haunt me. Everything started on a Monday morning. I was sitting in my office going through payroll when my phone reminded me it was Emily's birthday. 28. I smiled, put the paperwork aside, and called her. Straight to voicemail, no big deal. She worked in marketing, and Mondays were always busy. I left a quick message. "Happy birthday, sweetheart. I hope you're having an amazing day. Call me when you get a chance. Love you." Then I ordered flowers to be delivered to her office, just like I had every birthday since she started working. By that evening, she still hadn't called. Susan noticed before I said anything. "No birthday phone call?" I glanced at my screen. Not yet. I'm sure she's just busy. I know. At least, that's what I told myself. The next morning I called again. Voicemail, no text, no reply. That felt strange. Emily had never ignored me on her birthday, not once. So I called Ryan. He always knew what was going on with his sister. His phone went straight to voicemail too. I frowned. Now I wasn't just confused. I was starting to feel uneasy. I left him a message. "Hey buddy, give me a call when you can. Just trying to reach your sister." Hours passed. Nothing. By Wednesday morning, my phone hadn't made a sound. No missed calls, no texts, no emails, nothing from either of them. That's when my imagination started doing what every parent's imagination does. Maybe there had been a car accident. Maybe one of them was in the hospital. Maybe their phones had been stolen. Maybe. Susan found me standing in the kitchen staring at my phone like it was about to give me an answer. "You didn't sleep, did you?" I shook my head. "I've got a bad feeling." She walked over and squeezed my hand. "Call them again." "I already have." "I know, do it one more time." So I did. Emily, voicemail, Ryan, voicemail. I looked at Susan. She looked just as worried as I felt. Neither of us said a word. Then my phone rang. "Ryan." I answered before the first ring had even finished. "Ryan? Thank God. Are you okay?" There was a long pause. Then I heard him laugh. A quiet, almost amused laugh. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't an emergency. It was something far worse. For a second, I didn't say anything. I just stood there, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Ryan?" I asked again. "What's so funny?" His laughter faded. "You've called enough, Dad." I frowned. "What?" "You heard me." There was no anger in his voice. That almost made it worse. He sounded calm, like he'd rehearsed this conversation. "I've been trying to reach you for 3 days," I said. "Your mother and I thought something had happened." "I know." "You know?" "Yeah." Another pause. Then he said something I'll never forget. "We saw every call." I felt my stomach drop. What do you mean you saw every call? I mean exactly that. We saw your missed calls. We listened to your voicemails. If you knew we were trying to reach you, I said slowly, why didn't you answer? Because we didn't want to. The words hit harder than I expected, not because he was yelling, because he wasn't. It was the kind of calm honesty that leaves no room for misunderstanding. I looked across the kitchen. Susan was watching my face, trying to read the conversation without hearing a single word. Ryan, I said, forcing myself to stay calm, your mother has barely slept. We honestly believed something terrible had happened. I know. Then why would you do this? He let out a long sigh. Because this was the only way you'd finally get the message. What message? That we're adults. I blinked. I know you're adults. No, Dad, you don't. His voice stayed steady. You still call to check on us. You still ask where we are. You still want updates about everything. I called because it was your sister's birthday. I know. I called because nobody answered. I know. I called because I was scared. I know. Every answer was exactly the same. I know. The fear I'd been carrying for 3 days slowly turned into something else. Something heavier. Ryan, I said quietly, did you let your mother believe you might be dead? Just to prove a point? This time he didn't answer. The silence told me everything. Finally, he spoke again. Emily and I talked about this for months. Months, not days, not weeks, months. We decided we needed some distance. I felt like I'd missed an entire chapter of my own life. Distance from what? You? I closed my eyes for a second. Ryan, if we've done something to hurt you, then talk to us. We're your parents. We can work through it. It's not one thing. Then what is it? You'll understand soon enough. Before I could ask another question, the line went dead. He had hung up. I stared at my phone for several seconds before Susan quietly asked, what happened? I looked at her. They ignored us on purpose. She didn't move. They saw every call. The color drained from her face. No. I nodded. They planned this. Susan slowly sat down at the kitchen table. I don't understand. Neither do I. The room was completely silent. Then my phone buzzed again. An email from Emily. The subject line contained only 4 words. Please respect our boundaries. I opened it. By the time I reached the end of the first paragraph, I realized the silence hadn't been an accident. It had been the beginning of something much bigger. Susan read the email twice, then a third time. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were filled with confusion. I don't understand this, she whispered. Neither did I. The email wasn't angry. It wasn't emotional. That almost made it worse. It read like a business memo. Emily wrote that she and Ryan had spent a long time discussing their relationship with us. They believed we'd become emotionally dependent on them, and that our constant calls and check-ins were preventing them from living independent adult lives. She said they needed space, real space, no surprise visits, no repeated phone calls, no guilt, no pressure. And then came the sentence that made my chest tighten. If we don't answer, please assume we're fine and wait until we're ready to contact you. Susan lowered the phone. So, we're supposed to pretend they don't exist? I guess that's what they're asking. She stared out the kitchen window. I talked to Emily 4 days before her birthday. She asked me for my lasagna recipe. I nodded. She sounded completely normal. There wasn't a single sign that something was wrong. Neither of us could figure it out. Families don't usually fall apart overnight. There are arguments, warning signs, tension. Looking back, I searched for something I'd missed, anything, but nothing made sense. That afternoon, I couldn't concentrate at work. My project manager, Dave, knocked on my office door. You've looked at the same estimate for 20 minutes. I forced a smile. Family stuff. He leaned against the doorway. My oldest ignored me for a week once. I looked up. What happened? He forgot his charger at a lake house. No phone. His wife called us from a borrowed cell. I almost laughed. I wish it were that simple. Dave could tell there was more to the story, but he didn't ask. Good employees know when to give someone space. When I got home that evening, Susan was sitting at the dining room table. She had pulled out 2 old photo albums. One showed Emily at 6 years old, covered in birthday cake frosting because she'd insisted on blowing out the candles twice. Another showed Ryan holding a fishing rod that was almost taller than he was. Susan smiled through tears. Remember this trip? I remember he dropped the fish back into the lake because he felt bad. She laughed quietly. He cried harder than the fish. For a few minutes, we forgot about the email. We remembered our children. Not the adults we'd spoken to that morning. The little boy who couldn't stand to see a fish suffer. The little girl who used to run to the front door every evening yelling, "Daddy's home." Those memories made what was happening now feel even harder to believe. Around 9 that night, my phone lit up again. For one brief second, I thought one of them had changed their mind. It wasn't Ryan. It wasn't Emily. It was an unknown number from Charlotte. I answered immediately. "Hello? Mr. Donovan?" A woman's voice, professional, calm. "Yes. My name is Melissa. I'm calling from Harbor Ridge Apartments. Your name is listed as the guarantor on Emily Donovan's lease." I frowned. That's right. "We're processing her renewal, but we're missing one financial document. We just need to verify a few details before tomorrow afternoon." I glanced towards Susan. She looked back at me. Neither of us said a word. Emily had just asked us to stay out of her life. Yet she was still living in an apartment that depended on my signature. And for the first time in 30 years, I didn't know what the right thing to do was. I thanked the woman from the leasing office and told her I'd call back within the hour. When I hung up, Susan was still watching me. "That was Emily's apartment?" I nodded. "They need my approval to renew the lease." She leaned back in her chair and let out a slow breath. I don't even know what to say anymore. Neither did I. For almost 30 years, helping my kids had been automatic. I never kept score. If they needed advice, I gave it. If they needed a loan, I figured something out. If they needed a place to land after college, our guest room was always ready. That's what parents do. Or at least, that's what I believed. Susan finally broke the silence. "What happens if you don't sign?" I rubbed my forehead. "They'll have to qualify on their own." "And can Emily?" "I honestly don't know." She looked down at the table. "They told us to stay out of their lives." "I know. But they're still depending on yours." That sentence stayed with me. Not because it was cruel, because it was true. That evening, I opened the folder where I kept copies of every document I'd ever co-signed. There were more than I remembered. Emily's apartment lease, Ryan's business credit application, a small personal loan he'd taken out 3 years earlier when he decided to open his architecture studio. Even a car loan I'd guaranteed after the bank offered him a better interest rate because my name was attached. I wasn't paying their bills. They made their own payments. But my credit, my reputation, and in some cases my company's financial strength were quietly supporting everything underneath them. I sat back in my chair. I had never really looked at it that way before. Susan walked into the study carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed me one and glanced at the paperwork spread across the desk. I forgot about Ryan's business loan. So did I. She picked up one of the folders. "You trusted them?" "I did." "No." She smiled sadly. "You trusted your children." There was a difference. Around 8 that night, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a text. For one brief second, I thought it was Emily. It wasn't. It was Ryan. There were only two sentences. Please don't contact the leasing office. We'll handle everything ourselves. I stared at the screen. No apology. No explanation. Not even a, how are mom and dad? Just instructions. Susan read the message over my shoulder. They don't even know what the leasing office called you about. I know. They're assuming you'll do what you've always done. I looked back at the paperwork. Maybe she was right. Maybe my children had stopped seeing my help as a gift. Maybe they'd started seeing it as a guarantee, something that would always be there, whether they appreciated it or not. The next morning, I drove to work earlier than usual. I wasn't thinking about roofing contracts or payroll. I was thinking about one question. At what point does helping someone stop being love and start becoming permission? That question stayed with me all morning. Then, just before lunch, my attorney called back. I got your voicemail, Michael, he said. You sounded serious. I am. What do you need? I looked out the window at the crews loading trucks for another day's work. Then I took a deep breath. I need you to tell me exactly what happens. If I remove my name from every agreement my children still depend on. Paul Reynolds had been my attorney for almost 20 years. He'd handled business contracts, property purchases, and more paperwork than I cared to remember. But he also knew my family. He'd met Emily and Ryan when they were teenagers. He'd watched them grow up. The moment he picked up the phone, he knew something was wrong. Michael, he said, what's going on? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked out the window of my office. My roofing crews were loading ladders onto their trucks, laughing about something that had happened over the weekend. Life outside my office was moving exactly as it always had. Mine wasn't. I need to know what I'm legally responsible for, I finally said. In what sense? I've co-signed more things for my kids than I can remember. Paul was quiet for a moment. Did something happen? I gave him the short version, the unanswered calls, the email, the conversation with Ryan, the request to stay out of their lives. When I finished, he didn't speak for several seconds. I've known you a long time, he finally said. I've never heard your voice sound like this. I don't know what I'm supposed to do anymore. Do you want my legal opinion or my personal one? I'll take both. My personal opinion, he said. Don't make any decisions while you're hurt. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. And legally? Legally, every agreement is different. Some you can walk away from, some require notice. Others stay in place until the contract ends. I want to review all of them. Every single one? Every single one? I'll have my assistant pull the files. Before hanging up, Paul asked one last question. Have your children asked you for money recently? No. Have they thanked you for everything you're already guaranteeing? I didn't answer. Because I couldn't remember the last time either of them had. That afternoon, I couldn't focus on work. I kept replaying Ryan's voice in my head. We saw every call. Not, sorry, Dad. Not, we were busy. Just, we saw every call. The more I thought about it, the less it felt like a misunderstanding. It felt planned. When I got home, Susan was sitting on the back porch with 2 mugs of coffee waiting for me. She could always tell what kind of day I'd had before I said a word. Paul? I nodded. He's reviewing everything. She looked out across the backyard where our kids had spent years chasing each other with water balloons every summer. Do you remember when Ryan broke that maple tree? I laughed quietly. He swore the baseball never touched it. It split right down the middle. And somehow he blamed the neighbor's dog. For the first time in days, we both smiled. Not because things were getting better, because we were remembering a version of our children that felt impossibly far away. The smile disappeared when Susan asked the question we'd both been avoiding. What if they never call again? I didn't answer immediately. The truth was, I'd been asking myself the same thing. Finally, I said, then we'll have to learn how to live with that. She stared into her coffee. I never thought becoming parents would prepare us for letting go. It doesn't. No. It prepares you for holding on. The next morning, Paul called back. I've got the files. And there are more connections than either of us remembered. He began reading them one by one. Emily's apartment lease, Ryan's business credit line, the commercial vehicle guarantee for his architecture firm, a personal loan, and one document I had completely forgotten existed. Paul stopped speaking for a second before continuing. Michael, if Ryan's business defaults, your company is legally exposed. I sat up straighter. What? It's not catastrophic, Paul said, but it's significant. How significant? He gave me the number. For a moment, I honestly thought I'd misheard him. I asked Paul to repeat the number. He did. Slower this time. It wasn't enough to bankrupt my company, but it was more than enough to put years of hard work at risk if Ryan's business ever failed. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. I honestly forgot I signed that. You signed it because he couldn't qualify on his own, Paul replied. I remember. He promised he'd refinance within a year. I laughed quietly. That was almost 4 years ago. Paul didn't laugh. Michael, this isn't unusual. Parents help their kids all the time. The problem isn't that you helped them. The problem is that they still expect it. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. After we hung up, I pulled Ryan's business website up on my computer. The homepage looked impressive. Professional photos, modern office, big promises, successful projects. If you didn't know better, you'd think the company was thriving. Then I opened the financial reports Paul had emailed me. The numbers told a different story. Revenue had slowed. Several invoices were overdue. 2 commercial loans had recently been extended instead of paid off. Nothing catastrophic. Not yet. But it was clear Ryan wasn't standing on his own nearly as much as he believed. And suddenly, his words echoed in my head. We don't need you anymore. I stared at the screen. Maybe he actually believed that. Maybe he had no idea how much of his life was still being held together by signatures he'd stopped thinking about years ago. That evening, Susan found me in the study surrounded by folders. You've been in here for hours. I know. She walked over and looked at the paperwork. I forgot about half of these. So did I. She sat down across from me. Can I ask you something? Of course. If Ryan or Emily called tonight and apologized. I looked at her. Would you sign everything tomorrow? The question caught me off guard. I didn't answer immediately because I honestly didn't know. I think I would, I admitted. Susan nodded. I would too. Then she quietly added, but they haven't called. No, they haven't apologized. No. They've asked us to disappear. I closed another folder, and somehow, they still expect us to stay in the background holding everything up. The next morning, I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when my phone buzzed. Emily. For one hopeful second, I thought she was finally calling. Instead, it was another email. No greeting, no apology, no birthday joke, just one short paragraph. Please don't contact my apartment management, my employer, or anyone connected to my personal life. I need you to respect the boundaries we've asked for. I read it twice. Then a third time. She wasn't asking how her mother was doing. She wasn't asking why we'd been so worried. She wasn't even acknowledging the 3 days of silence. She was simply giving instructions Again. Susan looked at me from across the kitchen. What now? I slowly locked my phone. I think, I said quietly, our children have mistaken love for obligation. Around noon, Paul called again. I've finished reviewing every document. And? You have every legal right to remove yourself from some of these agreements. How many? Enough to change their lives. I didn't respond. He waited a few seconds before asking, Michael, are you sure this is really what you want? I looked through my office window at the company I'd spent 30 years building. Then I thought about 3 days of unanswered calls. A birthday, a frightened mother, and a son who laughed before telling me he'd ignored every message on purpose. Finally, I answered, I don't know what I want anymore. But I do know. I can't keep pretending nothing has changed. I barely slept that night. Not because I'd made a decision, because I hadn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing Ryan's voice. We saw every call. Those 4 words played over and over in my head. Not once had he said, I'm sorry we scared you. Not once had Emily asked how her mother was doing after 3 days of silence. It was as if our fear had never mattered. The next morning, I arrived at the office before anyone else. The warehouse was quiet. The trucks hadn't left yet. For the first time in years, I sat alone in my office with no music, no emails, no meetings, just me, and a stack of papers that suddenly felt heavier than they had any right to. I picked up Emily's lease first. 3 years earlier, she'd called me in tears after losing a bidding war on 2 different apartments. I finally found one I love, she'd said, but they won't approve me without a guarantor. I never hesitated. I drove across town that same afternoon, signed the paperwork, and told her not to worry about it. She cried. Then she hugged me and said, I'll never forget this, Dad. I smiled to myself. Funny how promises change. Ryan's file was even thicker. Business plans, bank documents, equipment financing. Every signature reminded me of another conversation, another moment when he believed in a dream, and I believed in him. I wasn't ashamed of helping my children. I'd do it all again. What hurt wasn't the money. It was realizing they'd rewritten the story in their own minds. Somehow, the help had become control. The support had become interference. And the father who showed up every time they needed him had become the problem. Around 10 that morning, Susan called. How are you holding up? I've been better, I figured. There was a brief silence before she asked, Have you decided? No. But I'm getting closer. I've been thinking too, she said. About what? About something my mother used to tell me. I leaned back in my chair. What was it? She answered without hesitation. The hardest part of being a parent isn't teaching your children to walk. It's knowing when to stop catching them every time they fall. I didn't say anything, because deep down, I knew she was right. That afternoon, Paul emailed every document we'd discussed. One attachment stood out from the rest. Termination of personal guarantee. I opened it. 1 signature. That's all it would take. 1 signature, and Emily would have to qualify for her apartment on her own. 1 signature, and Ryan's business would have to stand on its own credit. I stared at the page for nearly 5 minutes. Then I closed the file. Not yet. If there was even the smallest chance my children wanted to fix this, I wanted to give them that opportunity. As if on cue, my phone rang. Emily. For a split second, hope rushed back. I answered immediately. Emily? She didn't say hello. She didn't ask how I was. Her first words were, I heard the leasing office called you. They did. I need you to sign the renewal today. I waited. Surely there was more. There wasn't. No apology, no acknowledgement of the past 3 days, just business. I took a slow breath. Emily? I was hoping we could talk first. We don't need another conversation, Dad. I think we do. No. Her voice remained calm, almost impatient. We've already explained everything. You explained what you wanted. You never asked how your mother was doing. Silence. Then, we're not talking about Mom right now. That sentence hurt more than I expected. I looked out the office window. My employees were laughing in the parking lot. Life kept moving, but mine felt frozen. Finally, I spoke. I'll think about the lease. Emily didn't respond. Instead, she said something that made my heart sink. Just remember, if you don't sign, whatever happens next will be your fault. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone. Then I opened Paul's email again. This time, I didn't close the document. I left Paul's email open for nearly an hour. The cursor blinked at the bottom of the page, waiting for my signature. It looked so simple. One name, one click. Years of responsibility would begin to disappear. But nothing about it felt simple. I wasn't trying to punish my children. I was trying to understand where my responsibility ended and theirs began. Around lunchtime, Paul stopped by my office. He preferred talking face to face when something mattered. He closed the door behind him and sat across from my desk. You haven't signed. No. I figured. He folded his hands. I've represented a lot of families over the years. I know. And I can usually tell when someone is acting out of anger. He looked me straight in the eye. You're not angry, Michael? I'm not? No. You're heartbroken. I looked down at the papers. He was right. Anger burns hot. What I felt was cold, heavy, like carrying something for so long that I'd forgotten how much it weighed. Paul slid another folder across the desk. Before you make any decision, I think you should see this. I opened it. Inside were copies of the guarantees I'd signed over the years. Each one had a date. Each one had my signature. But what caught my attention wasn't the paperwork. It was the pattern. Every single time one of my children had reached a major milestone, buying a car, leasing an apartment, starting a business, there I was, standing quietly in the background, making it possible. I smiled to myself, not because I regretted it, because I'd never once expected anything in return. Paul spoke carefully. Helping your children wasn't a mistake? I know. But continuing to protect adults who insist they don't need you, that's a different conversation. I nodded slowly. I just wish they'd talk to us. So do I. That evening, Susan was watering the flowers along the front porch when I pulled into the driveway. She smiled as I walked over. Long day? The longest. She handed me the hose. You finish. I laughed. I always end up doing the watering. You always said I drowned the roses. You do. For a few quiet minutes, we stood side by side without saying much. The sun was beginning to set. It reminded me how peaceful our house used to feel. Then Susan broke the silence. I got a call today. I turned toward her. From who? Our neighbor, Linda. What about? She ran into Emily at the grocery store. My heart skipped. What did Emily say? Nothing. Susan looked away. She saw Linda, smiled, asked how everyone in the neighborhood was doing. She paused, and never once asked about us. The words landed harder than I expected. Emily wasn't avoiding us because she couldn't face us. She was simply choosing not to think about us. That realization hurt more than any argument ever could. The next morning, I made a decision. Not the legal one, the personal one. I wasn't going to chase my children anymore. No more unanswered phone calls. No more texts asking if they were okay. No more emails trying to fix something they refused to discuss. If they wanted distance, I would finally give it to them. Completely. I picked up my phone. For the first time in years, I deleted the weekly reminder that repeated every Sunday afternoon. Call Emily. Then I deleted another one. Check in with Ryan. I stared at the empty screen. It seemed like such a small thing, but it felt enormous, almost like admitting that a chapter of my life had ended. At exactly 3:17 that afternoon, my phone rang. Ryan. I watched his name appear on the screen. Yesterday, I would have answered before the first ring finished. Today, I let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Finally, it stopped. A few seconds later, a voicemail notification appeared. I didn't press play. Not yet. For the first time, Ryan would have to wait for me. I stared at the voicemail notification for several minutes. Part of me wanted to hear Ryan's voice. The other part wasn't ready. For years, I dropped everything when my kids called. Meetings could wait, dinner could wait, even vacations could wait. If my phone said Emily or Ryan, I answered. Always. Today was different. Today, I let the voicemail sit there. When I got home that evening, Susan noticed something immediately. You look calmer. I don't know if calmer is the right word. What is it then? Tired? She nodded. I know that feeling. I handed her my phone. Ryan called. Her eyes widened. You talked? No. You missed it? I chose not to answer. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she quietly smiled. I'm proud of you. I laughed. I don't feel proud. I know. But sometimes the hardest thing a parent can do is stop rescuing people who never asked if they were hurting you. After dinner, I finally played the voicemail. Ryan sounded annoyed. Not worried, not concerned. Annoyed. Dad, it's Ryan. A short pause. The leasing office said they're still waiting. Another pause. If you're busy, just call me back tonight. Then, almost as an afterthought, I need to get this taken care of. That was it. No. How are you? No. Is Mom okay? No. Can we talk? Just another problem that needed solving, and apparently, I was still expected to solve it. The next morning, Paul called before I even made it to the office. I got a message from Ryan. That caught me off guard. He called you? He wanted to know why the paperwork hadn't been processed. I closed my eyes. What did you tell him? The truth. And what was that? That I represent you. Paul paused. And that I don't discuss my clients with anyone else. For the first time in days, I smiled. Thank you. He wasn't happy. I figured. Around noon, my receptionist buzzed my office. Michael? Yeah? There's someone here asking for you. Who is it? She hesitated. He didn't have an appointment. My stomach tightened. Who? It's Ryan. I froze. He says he'll wait. I looked through the glass wall toward the reception area. There he was. Same confident posture, same expensive jacket, same phone in his hand. He looked exactly like the successful architect everyone admired. But something was different. For the first time, he looked impatient because for the first time, he was the one waiting. I didn't rush out. Instead, I finished reading the email on my screen, signed one estimate, returned a call from a supplier, took a sip of coffee that had already gone cold. Only then did I stand up. As I walked toward reception, Ryan looked up. Dad? I nodded. Ryan? He smiled politely. The kind of smile you'd give a business client, not your father. I figured it would be easier to talk in person. About what? The lease. Nothing else. Not Mom. Not the phone calls. Not the email. The lease. I gestured toward the conference room. Come on. We sat across from each other at the long oak table. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Ryan slid a folder across the table. I just need your signature. I didn't even look at it. Instead, I folded my hands and asked the first question that had been living in my head for over a week. Ryan, when Mom thought you might be dead, did that bother you at all? His confident expression faded just for a second. It was the first crack I'd seen since this whole nightmare began. Ryan looked down at the table. For the first time since he'd walked into my office, he didn't have an answer ready. He let out a slow breath. I knew you were going to ask me that. And? He rubbed the back of his neck. I knew Mom would worry. I waited. But I also knew she'd be okay. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She thought something terrible had happened to you. I know. She barely slept. I know. I leaned forward. And you still ignored every call. Ryan looked away. We had to make you understand. No, I said quietly. You wanted to make a point. They're the same thing. I shook my head. No, Ryan. They're not. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy. Finally, Ryan broke it. You don't understand what it's been like. Then explain it to me. He leaned back in his chair. You and Mom have always needed to know everything. When I moved to Nashville, you'd call every Sunday. I called because you asked me to. I did. And then every birthday. Every holiday. If I didn't answer, you'd call again. I nodded slowly, because I thought something might be wrong. Exactly, he pointed at me. That's the problem. I frowned. Worrying about your children is a problem when they're 30 years old? Sometimes it is. I let his words settle. Some of what he said wasn't completely unfair. I had called. I had checked in. Maybe more often than some parents, but there was one detail he kept ignoring. I only called again when you didn't answer. Ryan shrugged. Because I was busy. For 3 straight days? He hesitated. No. So why didn't you send one text? He didn't answer. You had time to coordinate this with Emily. You had time to write emails. You had time to ignore us. But somehow, what? You didn't have 10 seconds to type? We're okay. Ryan stared at the table. For the first time, he didn't have a response. A minute passed before he spoke again. We needed distance. I understand needing distance. I kept my voice calm. What I don't understand is why you had to make your mother believe she'd lost her son. His jaw tightened. That wasn't the goal, but you knew it would happen. He stayed silent. Sometimes, silence answers the question better than words ever could. Ryan finally looked back at me. We're not kids anymore. I know. We don't need permission for every decision. I've never expected that. It didn't feel that way. I thought about everything he'd said. Maybe there had been moments when I'd called too often. Maybe I'd worried more than I should have. Parents aren't perfect. I certainly wasn't. But none of that explained what they'd done. You know what hurts the most? I asked. Ryan looked at me. I was ready to apologize. For anything I did that made you feel smothered. His expression softened. But neither you nor your sister ever gave me that chance. You made your decision without a single honest conversation. Ryan sighed. We tried dropping hints. What hints? You'd call and I'd say I was busy. I believed you. I know. You'd say we'd talk later. I believed that too, he nodded. That's why Emily thought we'd have to do something bigger. Bigger, I repeated. You mean disappearing? He didn't answer. Instead, He looked toward the folder still sitting between us. So, are you going to sign? There it was. The real reason he'd come, not reconciliation, not understanding, not healing, the paperwork. I rested my hand on the folder but didn't open it. Then I asked one final question. If I sign today, what changes between us tomorrow? Ryan blinked. What do you mean? Will you call your mother? Silence. Will you come over for dinner? More silence. Will anything actually change? Other than you getting what you came here for? Ryan opened his mouth, then closed it again, because for the first time, he realized he didn't have an answer. Ryan looked down at the folder, then back at me. I didn't come here to argue. I know. I came because this needs to be signed. I nodded slowly, and I asked you a simple question. He shifted in his chair. If I sign this today, what changes? Ryan exhaled through his nose. I don't know. That's the first honest thing you've said since you walked in. His shoulders dropped a little. For the first time, he looked less like a confident businessman and more like the young man I'd taught to ride a bicycle. Just for a second, then the walls went back up. Dad, I'm not trying to hurt you. I looked at him carefully. I believe that. His eyebrows lifted. You do? Yes? I don't think you wanted to hurt us. I think you convinced yourself that hurting us was acceptable if it got you what you wanted. Ryan frowned. That's not fair, isn't it? You wanted distance. I understand that. But you chose silence over honesty. You chose fear over one difficult conversation. He didn't interrupt. He couldn't, because every word was true. Ryan folded his hands together. You have to understand something. I'm listening. When Emily and I talked about this, we honestly thought you'd be angry. I almost laughed. Angry? Yeah. We thought you'd call. You'd complain. You'd tell us we were ungrateful. Instead, you and Mom thought we were dead. His eyes fell to the table. I didn't expect that. No, you expected us to be annoyed. You never imagined we'd be terrified. Ryan didn't answer. His silence told me enough. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked something I'd been wondering ever since this started. Whose idea was it? Ryan looked up. What? The silence? He hesitated. It doesn't matter. It matters to me. Another pause. Finally, he sighed. It started with Emily. I wasn't surprised. She said if we kept answering every call, nothing would ever change. And you agreed. I did. Why? He stared through the conference room window. Because it seemed easier than having a conversation. I slowly nodded. There it is. What? The truth. Ryan looked confused. I've spent the last week wondering what your mother and I did that was so terrible. I spread my hands across the table. But this wasn't really about us. He frowned. What do you mean? It wasn't about abuse. It wasn't about control. It wasn't about some terrible childhood. It was about avoiding an uncomfortable conversation. His jaw tightened. You make it sound selfish. I think it was. Ryan looked genuinely frustrated now. You don't understand? Then help me. We were afraid. Of what? Disappointing you. The room fell quiet. That wasn't the answer I expected. Ryan continued. You've always been the guy who fixed everything. The successful business. The stable marriage. The dependable father. When we wanted something, you made it happen. He swallowed. And after a while, it started feeling impossible to tell you that we wanted less of you. I sat there for several seconds because for the first time, I heard something real. Not an excuse, not a demand, fear, misguided, poorly handled, but real. I wish you'd told me. Ryan nodded. I know. I would have listened. I know. I would have been hurt. I know. But we'd still be sitting at the same dinner table. Neither of us spoke. The conference room suddenly felt much smaller than before. Ryan glanced one last time at the folder. So, what happens now? I rested my hand on top of it. Then I slowly pushed it back across the table. Not signed, not rejected. Just returned. I'm not making this decision today. Ryan looked surprised. I know what you thought. I stood up. You believed I'd eventually do what I've always done. I walked toward the conference room door before turning back. But for the first time in your life, you're going to have to wonder what I'm going to do next. Ryan didn't move. He simply watched me leave. And as I closed the door behind me, I realized something. For the first time since this nightmare began, the uncertainty belonged to him. Ryan stayed in the conference room for another minute after I walked out. My receptionist told me later that he just sat there staring at the folder. Eventually, he picked it up, thanked her on the way out, and left without another word. I watched his car pull out of the parking lot from my office window. For years, I'd believed the hardest part of parenting was protecting your children. I was beginning to realize the hardest part was stepping back. That evening, Susan asked the question I knew was coming. How did it go? I loosened my tie and sat across from her at the kitchen table. He came for the lease. She nodded. I figured. He said they needed space. And he still needs my signature. Susan gave a sad little smile. That's a strange kind of independence. It is. I told her everything. The conversation, his explanation, his admission that he and Emily never expected us to think something terrible had happened. When I finished, she didn't speak for a while. Finally, she asked, "Do you believe him?" I thought carefully before answering. I believe he convinced himself he was doing the right thing. And was he? No. Susan reached across the table and took my hand. You know, I've been thinking about something too. What? If Emily had just called me and said, "Mom, I love you, but I need some space," she shrugged. I probably would have cried. I squeezed her hand. I know, but I would have understood. She smiled sadly. Instead, she made me think I might never hear her voice again. Neither of us had anything else to say. Some pain simply doesn't need more words. The next morning, Paul called. I've drafted everything. Everything? The notices, the releases, the documents to remove you where legally possible. I looked at the stack of contracts on my desk. How many can actually be canceled? Not all of them, but enough. He paused. I still want you to sleep on it. I plan to. I mean really sleep on it. Because once some of these notices go out, there's no taking them back. I understand. After we hung up, I opened my calendar. Every Wednesday for the past 12 years, there had been a recurring reminder. Lunch with Mom. It wasn't about my mother. It was a reminder to take Susan out in the middle of the week. Life had become busy when the kids were younger. Work was growing. There were soccer games, school plays, college visits. Somewhere along the way, I created that reminder so no matter how hectic life became, Susan and I would still have one afternoon that belonged to us. I smiled. Even after all these years, it was still there. Without thinking, I walked into the living room. What are you doing tomorrow? Susan looked up from her book. I don't think we have any plans. We do now. She smiled. A date? A real one? She laughed. It's been a while. It has? For the first time in over a week. Our conversation wasn't about Emily or Ryan. It was about us. About the two people who'd built a life together long before children came along, and who still had each other after the house had grown quiet. The next afternoon, we drove to a small restaurant overlooking the river. It wasn't fancy. It never had been. In fact, we'd celebrated our 10th anniversary there because we couldn't afford anywhere more expensive. Susan ordered the same grilled salmon she'd been ordering for nearly 20 years. I ordered the pot roast. Some habits never change. Halfway through lunch, she looked at me and smiled. I've missed this. So have I. You know what's strange? What? For the first time in days, I haven't checked my phone. I looked down. Neither had I. For a moment, life felt almost normal again. Then my phone vibrated. I glanced at the screen. Emily, I looked at Susan. She saw the name. Neither of us reached for the phone. It rang once, then stopped. A second later, another call came in. This time, Ryan. I let that one ring too. When both calls ended, two voicemails appeared almost instantly. Susan looked at me. They've never called twice before. No. What do you think happened? I stared at the screen, then at the untouched dessert sitting between us. For the first time, it wasn't us chasing them. It was them, trying to reach us. I looked at the two missed calls, one from Emily, one from Ryan. Then I slipped my phone back into my pocket. Susan raised an eyebrow. You're not going to listen to the voicemails? Not yet. She studied my face for a second. I never thought I'd see the day. Neither did I. For years, I had trained myself to react the moment my phone rang. If one of the kids called, everything else stopped. Work could wait, dinner could wait, sleep could wait. My children always came first. Now, for the first time, I was finishing lunch with my wife before answering anyone else. We ordered dessert. Susan laughed as the waitress placed a slice of cheesecake between us. We used to split one of these every anniversary. We still are. She smiled. You know. I forgot how nice it is when nobody needs something from us. I looked around the restaurant. Couples talked quietly over coffee. An older man was teaching his granddaughter how to fold a paper napkin into a bird. Life kept moving. Maybe ours finally could too. By the time we got back to the car, my phone showed another missed call. Ryan again. Then another notification. A text. Dad, please call me when you can. It's important. I stared at the screen. Susan noticed. What does it say? I handed her the phone. She read it once, then looked back at me. That's different. It is. He said please. It was such a small word, but after everything that had happened, it stood out. When we got home, I finally listened to the voicemails. Ryan's came first. His voice was different this time, less confident. Dad, I know you're probably busy. A pause. I'd appreciate it if you could call me back. Another pause. I think we need to talk. No mention of the lease, no mention of paperwork. Just, we need to talk. I played Emily's message next. She sounded nervous. Hi, Dad. It had been days since I'd heard her call me that. She stopped for a second, searching for words. I'd really like to speak with you when you have time. Another pause. Please? The voicemail ended. Susan looked at me. That's the first time she sounded unsure. I nodded slowly. They're realizing something. What? I don't think they expected silence to feel like this. That evening, I sat on the back porch as the sun disappeared behind the trees. For the first time in over a week, my mind wasn't racing. I wasn't planning what to say. I wasn't rehearsing another conversation. I was simply sitting still. Susan joined me with 2 cups of tea. You look peaceful. I feel lighter. She handed me my mug. Do you know why? I thought about it. Because I finally stopped trying to control something I can't control. She smiled. I think that's called acceptance. Maybe she was right. The next morning, Paul called. I heard from the leasing office. I frowned. You did? They wanted to know if the guarantor paperwork was still being renewed. And I told them no decision has been made. He paused. Michael. They also mentioned something else. What? Emily asked if there was any way to qualify without a guarantor. I leaned forward. Can she? Possibly. If she provides additional income verification. I smiled. So there is another option. There always was. I frowned. What do you mean? Paul sighed. No one ever asked. The room fell silent. For years, I'd assumed my children came to me because they had no choice. Now I realized sometimes they came to me simply because it was easier. Just before lunch, my office phone rang. My receptionist's voice came over the intercom. Michael? Yes? Your daughter is here. I froze. Emily? Yes. She says. The receptionist hesitated. She'd like to apologize. I slowly stood up from my desk, not because everything had been fixed, not because the pain was gone, but because, for the first time since this began, someone had finally come, not to ask for a signature, but to have a conversation. Emily was standing in the reception area when I walked out. She looked different, not because of the clothes, not because of the hairstyle. She simply looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes. Her shoulders were tense, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't look like someone who had everything under control. When she saw me, she stood up. Hi, Dad. Hi, Emily. Neither of us moved. Neither of us knew whether a hug would be welcome. So we simply stood there for a moment. Finally, I gestured toward my office. Come in. She sat across from my desk, folding and unfolding her hands. The silence stretched between us. Finally, she spoke. I'm sorry. I looked at her. She kept her eyes on the floor. I know that's probably not enough. No, I said quietly. It isn't. She nodded. I figured. Another long silence settled over the room. Then she looked up. I've replayed everything in my head 100 times. So have I. I never wanted Mom to think we were dead. Then why let her? Emily swallowed. Because once we'd started, I didn't know how to stop. I leaned back in my chair. You could have sent one text. I know. You could have called. I know. You could have told us you needed space. I know. Every answer was the same. Not defensive, not angry, just, I know. After a while, Emily wiped at her eyes. I thought if I talked to you, I'd lose my nerve. What nerve? To finally say what I'd been feeling. So you chose silence. She nodded. I convinced myself it would hurt less. I gave a sad smile. It hurt everyone more. A tear rolled down her cheek. I know. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I wrote something. I took it from her. It wasn't long. Just a single page. She'd written it by hand. The first sentence caught my attention immediately. Dad, I spent so much time trying to become independent that I forgot independence isn't the same thing as pushing people away. I kept reading. She admitted that she and Ryan had spent months convincing each other they were trapped, that every phone call felt like pressure, every check-in felt like an obligation. But after the silence, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling free, she felt guilty, then lonely, then ashamed. I didn't know how to call after that, she admitted. Every day that passed made it harder. I nodded. That's usually how silence works. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. I don't expect everything to go back to normal. It can't. I know. Her voice cracked. I don't want this to be the way our family ends. I looked at the letter again, then at my daughter. For the first time since this all began, I could see she wasn't trying to win. She wasn't trying to get her way. She was trying to find her way back. There was an important difference. I folded the letter carefully and placed it on my desk. Emily? She looked up. I forgive you. She covered her mouth with both hands. But forgiveness, I continued, isn't the same thing as trust. She nodded immediately. I understand. Trust takes time. I know. It takes honesty. I know. And it takes consistency. I know. For the first time since she'd walked in, I believe she really did. She stood up slowly. I should go. I walked her to the office door. Before leaving, she stopped. There's something else. What is it? She hesitated. I didn't come here because of the lease. I waited. She took a deep breath. I already submitted the paperwork on my own. I blinked. You did? She nodded. If I qualify, I'll know I earned it. And if I don't, I'll figure something else out. For the first time in this entire ordeal, she wasn't asking me to solve the problem. She was accepting responsibility for it. As she reached the door, she turned back one last time. Mom still likes lemon pie, right? I smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. She does. Emily gave a small, hopeful smile. Then maybe, if she'll let me, I'd like to bring one over this weekend. I watched her walk out of the office, not because everything had been repaired, but because for the first time, the road back to being a family had finally begun. That Saturday afternoon, Susan was in the kitchen when the doorbell rang. She looked at me. Were you expecting someone? I shook my head. No. She wiped her hands on a towel and walked toward the front door. I followed a few steps behind. When she opened it, Emily was standing there, holding a lemon pie, exactly the kind Susan had always loved. For a second, no one spoke. Emily looked nervous, more nervous than I'd ever seen her. Finally, she smiled. Hi, Mom. Susan's eyes immediately filled with tears. Hi, sweetheart. Emily held up the pie with an awkward little laugh. I wasn't sure if you still liked this one. Susan smiled through her tears. I've never stopped. Neither had I. Emily stepped inside. The house looked exactly as she'd left it. The family photos were still on the walls. Her graduation picture was still on the bookshelf. Even the small scratch on the hallway table, the one she'd made dragging her suitcase through the house years ago, was still there. She noticed it. I can't believe you never fixed that, Susan laughed. You made that. I know. I guess I always liked the reminder. Emily looked down. So did I. We sat around the kitchen table. At first, the conversation was cautious. Work, the weather, traffic. The kinds of things people say when they are afraid to touch the real issue. Finally, Susan reached across the table. I'm glad you're here. Emily took her hand. I'm glad you opened the door. Neither of them could hold back their tears any longer. They stood up and hugged. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't perfect. It was simply a mother holding her daughter after believing, for one terrible week, that she'd lost her. Sometimes that's enough. About 20 minutes later, another knock came at the door. Emily looked toward it. I think that's Ryan. I opened the door. Sure enough, there he was, hands in his pockets, looking more uncomfortable than I'd ever seen him. Hey, Dad. Hey. He looked past me toward the kitchen. Is Mom? She's inside. He nodded, then quietly asked, Can I come in? I stepped aside. You never had to ask before. Ryan gave a small, embarrassed smile. I know. The afternoon wasn't filled with dramatic speeches. There were no magical words that erased what had happened. Instead, there were honest conversations, real ones. Ryan apologized, not just for ignoring the calls, but for convincing himself that avoiding conflict was kinder than facing it. Emily apologized to Susan through tears, more than once. Susan admitted she'd probably worried too much over the years. I admitted I'd sometimes mistaken helping for protecting. None of us claimed to be perfect. For the first time, we didn't need to. As the sun began to set, Ryan walked out onto the back porch with me. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, he broke the silence. "You never signed the lease." "No. I ended up qualifying on my own." "I heard." He smiled. "I was actually proud of myself. I was proud of you, too." He looked surprised. "You were? I always wanted you to stand on your own. I just never wanted you to think you had to stand alone." Ryan looked down at the yard where he'd spent countless summers throwing baseballs with me. "I understand that now." Before everyone left that evening, Emily handed Susan a small envelope. "Don't open it until we're gone." After their cars disappeared down the street, Susan opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. It simply read, "Thank you for never giving up on us, even when we made it very difficult to love us." There was one more thing inside. A small family photograph. It had been taken almost 15 years earlier during a camping trip. The four of us were smiling at the camera. Ryan had dirt on his face. Emily was laughing at something outside the frame. Susan was leaning against my shoulder, and I remembered exactly what had happened a few seconds before that picture was taken. Ryan had dropped every hot dog into the campfire. Emily couldn't stop laughing. Susan laughed so hard she cried. Back then, we had no idea how quickly life could change, or how easily people who love each other can drift apart, simply because no one is willing to have one honest conversation. It's been almost a year since all of this happened. Things aren't exactly the way they used to be. In some ways, they're better. Emily calls every couple of weeks. Not because she feels obligated, because she wants to. Ryan still runs his architecture firm without my guarantees. He's proud of that. So am I. Susan still worries, probably always will. She's a mother. That's part of who she is. And me? I finally learned something I'd spent decades getting wrong. Being a good parent doesn't mean solving every problem your children face. Sometimes. Being a good parent means loving them enough to let them solve those problems themselves. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. If there's one thing this experience taught our family, it's this. The strongest relationships aren't built on constant closeness. They're built on honest conversations, mutual respect, and the courage to say what's difficult before silence says it for you.